I'm Elizabeth Fraser from New College, Oxford. Lots of you in the room already know, and many of you in the room are working out that not all doctoral students are alike. And there are some doctoral students who are an absolute dream to supervise, and there are some doctoral students who are closer to a nightmare to supervise, about whom we don't say that, but we think it privately. And publicly, I'm going to say that John Leader Maynard was a dream to supervise. I've had many students who've been dreams to supervise, at least one of whom is in this room. But I met John as a master's student when he came to Oxford to do the MPhil in political theory, which is my field. And this theme about the analysis of discourse and how discourses work is very close to my own intellectual interests. And then I was very pleased to continue to supervise him when he expanded that work into the doctoral thesis, which has then been expanded into this book, which we are here to celebrate today. And I couldn't be more pleased to be in the chair. We've got a small but perfectly formed panel to discuss this work. What's going to happen this evening is that John is going to make a presentation of some of the arguments, what he was trying to do in the book. And then we've got two great commentators, Zeynep Bulutgil from UCL, whose work, relevant work, a lot of her work is relevant, but has written on the subject of ethnic cleansing, which is something, of course, that we all are very worried about and have reason to be worried about, and is now working on institutional secularization and the origins of secular institutions, which I have to say sounds really amazing, but for completely different reasons, or for somewhat different reasons from the themes that we're going to be discussing this evening. So Zeynep is then going to respond to John for 10 minutes or so. And then I'm very pleased that we're joined also by Kieran Mitten from King's College London, who works on urban violence and the crime conflict nexus, about which I think we're all very, very aware at the moment, that people who get drawn into extreme forms of violence for political purposes and get recruited into militias and so on, are often also, or have been, or started out as involved in petty crime. So that nexus is incredibly interesting, and I think is something that John's work bears on. Okay, there's then going to be plenty of time for questions from the audience, which I'm going to really try and take as many as I possibly can, and a more general discussion between the panel, but that's the running order. So, John, over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to stand, because I fidget. So I have to start very, very briefly with some thank yous. First of all, to you all for turning up. It's really moving doing this event to celebrate what I have poured far too much of my life into doing. This is a third of my life it took me to ultimately write this book, if you include the PhD as well, because I changed it all, basically, when I started turning it into a book. But so, yeah, it's a real privilege to be able to speak to you and to have you all here today. I obviously want to thank Liz, not only for chairing this event, but for the years of support and guidance that she gave me, both on the thesis and the doctorate and the master's, but also just in becoming an academic and a better thinker. And then obviously I'm really, really delighted and thankful that Zeynep and Kieran could be here to be my discussants today. This was my first choice panel, by the way. They all just said yes, and I was like, yes, I've won. And then I also need to thank Daniel Mansfield, Chloe Humphreys, and Alex Mortimer, who's here at the front, for helping me organise the event, and for the DPE for very generously funding the drinks that I hope all of you are now in here consuming, and the food as well. Finally, a little bit cliched, but I do want to thank Carol Leader and Michael Maynard, or Mum and Dad as they're called to me, who are over here in the row here. There are so many ways in which I am very, very lucky as a human being, but the greatest fortune of all is to have them be such fantastic parents to me and so supporting on the journey I've taken to academia. And this book would literally not be here without them, as indeed would I. So, so I think it's appropriate to thank them as well. Everyone in this room, I suspect, will have followed and be aware of the targeted killings of civilians that have been taking place over the last few months in Ukraine at the hands of Russian military forces. Those killings are what we now tend to call atrocity crimes, which is a term that's become developed to cover three categories of crime in international law: genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. It's a little bit early to tell whether or not Russian military atrocities in Ukraine will kind of meet the threshold of mass killing that I'm talking about in this book. I don't care much about numerical thresholds, but you could have a bit of a debate about that. But there's certainly the kinds of event that I am interested in, namely the systematic, large-scale killing of civilians. And I wrote this book in part out of a puzzlement that I share with many scholars, and hopefully all of you in the room, as to why mass atrocities of this kind, mass killings, occur. They are puzzling for a few reasons. First of all, they are obviously abhorrent. Most of us can't imagine participating in or supporting such crimes, although the evidence would suggest that when our own states engage in them, many of us do. They are rare. They are not, in fact, universal features of conflict. It's not as though whenever kind of society breaks down and we peel away the civilizing institutions of law and the state and the police, suddenly this kind of stuff breaks out. It doesn't. Mass killings occur in about between a fifth and a quarter of international conflicts. Most of the time, in most places, most states adhere to the international laws of war, international humanitarian law, and they don't engage in this kind of systematic targeting. So when they do, it begs the question, why? Third, in an important sense, there at least seems to be a pretty good case that this form of violence is irrational. Now, actually, a really important stream of research on horrific atrocities has tried to demonstrate that there is more rationality in atrocities than you might think, that they can serve important purposes and functions. Nevertheless, in almost every case, there are many other things that a state could do that look just as rational, at least as rational, if not more rational, than engaging in the targeting of civilians. Indeed, often, these forms of violence prove incredibly counterproductive for the very states and regimes that engage in them. Sometimes, as in what was then called East Pakistan, now Bangladesh in 1971, or say in ISIS's violence in Iraq and Syria, they alienate surrounding states and lead to interventions that topple the very people that are engaging in this form of violence. Sometimes, as with Joseph Stalin's purge of the Red Army in 1936 to 1937, they weaken these states against subsequent threats. So there's something puzzling about why we would think that states engage in them. That's the first reason why I wrote this book, because I wanted to contribute to answering, I won't say I've solved, but answering addressing that puzzle. The second reason why I wrote the book is because I was frustrated with the way in which ideology was talked about and analysed in most of the existing research that was taking place. Ideology has always been a central topic, an issue of controversy for those who research this kind of violence, going right back to kind of initial work on the Holocaust after World War II. Very few people say that ideology is totally irrelevant, but actually how much it matters and what role it plays is something that is deeply disputed and discussed between scholars. Simplifying enormously, there's two main camps, which in the book I call traditional ideological perspectives first and sceptical perspectives second. The first group, traditional ideological perspectives, tend to emphasize that ideology is incredibly important in mass killing and mass atrocities. It's incredibly important because particular kinds of worldviews generate particular kinds of hatreds against certain groups, and also kind of revolutionary goals to transform society that require certain social groups to be purged. Okay? The basic focus here is on, as I say, hatreds and radical goals. Hatreds and radical goals. That's what's in the ideology, and because people believe in the ideology, they're motivated to engage in these kind of horrific forms of violence. It's what I call traditional ideological perspectives. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, that perspective has become increasingly unpopular. What I call sceptical perspectives have attacked it on a few different grounds. I won't go into all of them, but very roughly on 2 main ones. First of all, many of the people who perpetrate these kinds of crimes don't actually seem to be kind of fanatical believers in ideology in the way that the traditional ideological perspective suggests. Secondly, the skeptical perspectives have shown that actually a range of other factors, such as, for example, the actual rational purposes, however ruthless and brutal, but the rational purposes that violence can be used to serve, violence against civilians, or the kind of social pressure and institutions and environments in which perpetrators find themselves, all of this kind of stuff is actually what generates the violence, these skeptical perspectives say. And so what you build up then is an image of the perpetrators as either relatively rational, if ruthless, but rational, they're doing what serves their interests, or as kind of conforming to social pressure. And they don't seem to look very ideological at all. Right? So that's kind of the debate that I was interested in intervening in. And my frustration with that debate is that I felt both sides made an assumption that seemed to me wrong. And that assumption is that if ideology were to matter, that must mean that people are deep, true believers in an ideology, and they act out of their commitment, their deep commitments to that ideology. As the skeptical perspectives point out, very few perpetrators, an important minority, but not the bulk of perpetrators of these kind of crimes, look like those kind of fanatical, true believers. But it seemed to me that that's just not how ideology ordinarily operates, right? If you look around this room or society, we will meet people who will call themselves left-wing and right-wing, liberal, conservative, socialist, social democratic, maybe a few communists even. We've certainly got some revivals of populists and fascists. None of them, or not none of them, few of them, really look like they are fanatical true believers in a kind of clearly worked out doctrine that has a concrete set of ideological goals that they seek to impose on society. That's not, I think, most of the time what ideology looks like. It's what it looked like in a kind of very classic Marxist-Leninist version of a certain kind of revolutionary movement in the 40s and 50s, and that's where the idea comes from. But it's not what actually ideology looks like the vast bulk of the time. And that, incidentally, I think is an important point to make, not only for mass killings, but actually for all other contexts where we talk about ideology. You get debates about, oh, is Boris Johnson ideological or not? Well, he's certainly not a big believer in almost anything but himself. But he has a worldview. He has an interpretation of things. He has certain consistent preferences that run across his career. He's relatively opportunistic. He may not meet your kind of image of the fanatic, but I would say he still has some kind of ideology. So in the book, I try to replace those two perspectives, traditional ideological and skeptical, with what I call a neo-ideological perspective, a revised theory of mass killings in which ideology plays a central role, but not quite the same role as is traditionally thought. And the book is 380 pages long, and I will not summarize it effectively here. But basically, I make 2 arguments. The first argument is that ideology is really important, but not because of these kinds of deep ideological commitments that I've been discussing, or at least not most of the time. There is an important minority, often amongst the leaders, who are really deeply ideologically committed and have been for a long time. But most of the perpetrators don't show that level of commitment. But instead, what ideologies nevertheless do or enable is a kind of justificatory narrative for mass killing, for targeting civilians, a set of ideas that make it look like targeting civilians is the strategically and morally right thing to do. And those narratives can shape perpetrator behavior in these crimes, can enable and encourage violence against civilians through multiple different mechanisms. The first of these is commitment. People might be really committed to the ideas. They might really deeply believe in the justificatory narrative and be like, yeah, this is definitely the right thing to do. But as I've said, I think that's true only of a minority. But there are 3 other mechanisms I add to that. The first I call adoption, which is that essentially people often take on board narratives or ideologies or ideological ideas that they're not deeply committed to, but because they fit well with other things that they believe. The most obvious example of this is that if you tell American voters that a particular policy is advocated by the party that they support, tell Democrats that Democrats are proposing this new policy, right? People who are Democrats will say, I love that policy is a really, really good idea. If you tell them that Republicans are supporting that policy, what a terrible policy, I think it's an awful idea, we couldn't possibly support that, right? They sincerely adopt the narrative that the policy is a right idea, but they're clearly not deeply committed to it. It's because of their identity, it's because of their identification with a particular party that then leads to them adopting that narrative. I often think that's what goes on in atrocities. People accept the justificatory narrative sincerely, but not because of long-standing commitment to it, but because it fits well with other things that they believe about society or because authorities are preaching it to them. Two other mechanisms, very quickly. People might not sincerely believe in the narrative at all, but they might nevertheless feel social pressure to conform to it. Their belief in the ideology is not motivating them to do what they're doing, but the content of the narrative still matters enormously. In a context where a justificatory narrative is propagated, people will feel pressure to conform to it. If you get instead a much more restrictive narrative that preaches, say, adherence to international humanitarian law, people will feel pressured to conform to that. So what kind of narrative gets peddled makes a lot of difference to the kind of pressure to what it is that people feel they need to conform to. Finally, people might make instrumental use of ideology, right? There might be all sorts of opportunistic, self-interested reasons that they have. Maybe they can use the justificatory narrative to advance their career or to legitimate violence that they'd in fact be producing for other motives. Now, their other motives might be doing, again, most of the work, but the narrative, the existence and availability of the narrative still makes the crucial difference as to whether violence against civilians is then seen to be a good way of pursuing their aims rather than some other course. The metaphor that I use in the book is I say that rather than thinking of ideology as a kind of deeply committed fanatical doctrine that only exists in people's heads, it's a kind of infrastructure for collective action, right? An infrastructure for collective violence. It sustains and it shapes certain patterns of joint, coordinated violent behavior amongst large groups of people of the kind that we see in mass killings. And consequently, we should be unsurprised that the perpetrators of mass killings are very diverse. They're guided by different motives, they're not all deep believers or true believers, and so on and so forth, but they can be bound together by this shared justificatory narrative. And where such a narrative exists, mass killing becomes possible. Where it doesn't exist or looks deeply implausible, it's much harder for people to engage in mass killing. That was argument one. Argument two, and then I will finish. As I described, in the traditional ideological perspective, and I would say that this is more widely true in society in general, the assumption is that the ideological roots of violence, if any, must be to do with kind of really alien values to mainstream ordinary societies, right? They're either like deep racist, supremacist hatreds of certain groups, or they're like radical, revolutionary aims to totally overturn and reorder the fabric of society. In a sense, it's the extraordinariness of the values and the goals that explain why you get such extraordinary violence. I think that is profoundly wrong. Not because such goals and hatreds don't play any role at all. They can do sometimes, depends on the case. It varies a little bit. But the most fundamental roots of mass killing are instead radicalized versions of very ordinary, mainstream, familiar ideas. In particular, ideas about security and the politics of security. What we see the vast bulk of perpetrators doing when they explain and justify and seem to express their understanding of their own actions is not, first and foremost, radical hatreds or radical goals or incredibly weird and unfamiliar values. It is claims about self-defense, the need to punish criminals, the duty to serve your fatherland, the loyalty that you need to show to your comrades and your peers, the military necessity of acting in this way. And that is what the one slide that I have for this presentation. If you haven't read the quotes, I encourage you to do. They're not endorsements. I didn't get Molotov to back the book. That's what the quotes on the slide, and there are hundreds more of quotes like this in the book, are meant to show. right? This is how the perpetrators understand what they are doing. Or even if they don't necessarily sincerely believe it, it's how they publicly describe and defend what they are doing. And relatively rarely did I find claims about hatreds or radical values. Again, I'm not saying they don't exist at all, but mainly it was this incredibly familiar security discourse. And what happens is that familiar set of security-based arguments, self-defense, punishment, duty, etc., what in the book I kind of organize into things that I'm not going to go into, but I call them the justificatory mechanisms of mass killing. What all of those are kind of bound into is this central justificatory narrative that essentially presents mass killing as an ordinary strategy of war, and civilians as essentially no different to enemy combatants, and consequently subject to the same kind of violence. So what matters, I argue, is not a kind of long-standing ideological plan to wipe out certain groups. That happens occasionally, but it's not what we see in the vast bulk of cases. What matters is instead the intersection of crises where elites and publics feel threatened and in danger with radical ideological doctrines of security that make it look like civilians are part of the problem, right? And it's that's the key role that ideology plays. And that's why the subtitle of the book, incidentally, is The Radicalized Security Politics, very odd phrase that I invented, of genocides and deadly atrocities. That's what I want to draw attention to. And to some extent, which I might pursue in future work, I think that's true more generally of forces of extremism, right? If we think about the growth of extremism in our society today, again, people want to make it seem like that's all about kind of really radical, extraordinary values and hatreds. I don't think it is. I think extremists mainly talk our language of self-defense and threat and fear, but they couple it to these incredibly radical narratives about what's going on in society, usually delusional narratives. But that's what I think defines extremism. So in the book, there are then 4 cases represented by the quotes on the slide. I'm not going to go into them. I look at state terror under Stalin in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, Allied area bombing of Germany between 1940 and 1945, the most controversial case for most people in a context like this, but I should emphasize I'm not talking about all bombing in World War II, but the particular campaign of bombing that the British and American air forces in particular used to directly target civilians. And if anyone in this room doesn't think that they directly targeted civilians, you can read the book. They say it themselves, that is exactly what they're doing, so that's not a contentious claim amongst historians. So I look at that. I look at Guatemala, the civil war in Guatemala, which raged from the 1960s to the 1990s, but in a particular sort of 3 to 5 year period between about 1978 and 1983, the Guatemalan state engaged in large-scale mass killing, in particular of the indigenous Maya people of Guatemala that make up about half the population of Guatemala. And then I look at the Rwandan genocide in 1994, probably a familiar case to many people in these rooms. Happy to talk about any more of that in the Q&A, but I won't go into a huge amount more detail. What I will say just on all of them is that in every case, and the cases are rather different, that was the point, but in every case, what I find is that violence is neither a kind of straightforwardly logical, rational response to real problems that the perpetrators faced, but nor was it the kind of traditional perspectives, radical ideological plan to reshape society. Even in the Soviet Union, Stalin actually became more murderous the more conservative he became. And the regime became more violent the more secure it was, and the more it became concerned with protecting and conserving its existing social order. But in every case, what I found was that essentially security concerns were first and foremost, but security interpreted in a very radical ideological way. So I'll close by saying that to some extent, although it's obviously still early days, I think that also helps make sense of what's going on in Ukraine right now. Those atrocities, I'm not claiming there's any silver lining here, those atrocities very much fit the pattern that I was expecting to see from my kind of research. Putin and the Russian government do not have grand plans to totally reshape society, not in any kind of detailed way, and certainly to the extent that they do have kind of thoughts about eradicating Ukrainian culture, that's very much second fiddle to a security discourse. The Ukrainians are out to destroy us. They are agents of the West. They represent a conspiracy against the Russian nation, and we are merely acting in self-defense. And that is exactly the kind of language that other perpetrators of mass killing have used throughout history. So on that sobering thought, all I can say is I hope the book helps anyone who wants to read it. And I am selling some copies at the end, by the way, if you want to come along. I hope it helps you understand events like that from both our past and our present. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, John, for a very illuminating and succinct account of the force of the book, which evidently everybody's appreciated. And now I'm going to ask Zeynep from University College London, Zeynep Bulutgil, to respond.
Thank you. And first of all, I'd like to thank Jonathan for inviting me to participate in this exciting book lounge. It's really a pleasure being here. What I'd like to do tonight is first sort of talk about what I think is the most important contribution of the book is. And then I'm going to sort of expand on that idea and talk about some sort of future research questions that come from this important contribution. So, in my view, the most important contribution of the book is challenging the idea that we can neatly separate approaches that focus on ideology from approaches that focus on strategy or security. Right, so the idea is that if you look at the literature, and Jonathan talked about this a little bit, there's sort of two broad approaches to mass killings, but even in IR scholarship in general. And one is the idea that mass killings are motivated by defensive measures. Right, so the idea is that the state is defending the territorial integrity, or it's defending the regime and the state, and sometimes those two things go together. And so they're sort of couched in this language of security that Jonathan talked about. On the other side, there are theories that emphasize really extreme ideologies, utopian, revolutionary ideologies. And in this case, they target groups that are seen as obstacles to achieving a new society, right? A new and revolutionized society. And instead, what the book is telling us is that the strategic justifications are themselves a manifestation of radicalized security ideologies. And the book shows this empirically across different geographical contexts, across different time periods, and in my opinion, most importantly, across different regimes, right? Looking at totalitarian regimes, but also looking at what we would consider liberal democracies. And I think this is an extremely important point to make that the book makes very elegantly. I'm going to now sort of talk about two potential extensions, and I think maybe they also sort of spark some debate, and I'd like to hear Jonathan also sort of comment on them. One is sort of, this is a finding in the book as well, and it exists in other works in the literature, and it is that radical secularized ideologies themselves vary from context to context. So you can actually see them emerge and become more robust over time in certain places. You can also see that some countries or contexts are closer to radicalized security ideologies to begin with. So one puzzle is, why is that the case? For example, in my work, the way I sort of try to explain this is by looking at what are the other sort of alternative political issues that societies can care about. Those issues often have to do with socioeconomic questions. They might have to do with religiosity. They might have to do with the extent to which actually the general public or the population cares about humanistic sort of moral values. And depending on the organizations and political parties in the society, these types of issues can actually serve as obstacles against the emergence of a radical sort of security ideology. So in some ways, you see this type of radicalized context in which when these other dimensions in some ways disappear, and the main focus is national security, defined in a very sort of radical way, defined in sort of as focusing on territorial integrity and also defending the state, sometimes also the regime. So I know through conversations with Jonathan that he's already thinking about these issues. So I'd like to give him some opportunity to sort of talk about this and also hear his thoughts about whether, we can have a uniform theory that gives us some sense of when radical security ideologies emerge, or do we need different theories to explain radicalization that targets ethnic groups versus radicalization that targets economic groups, urban groups, or the wealthy in a society or political elite? Or do we need a uniform theory? And I know he's thinking about these things. That's why, in some ways, I'm bringing them up. So that's sort of on the contribution or extension that relates to mass killings. But I think this point about security and the way we think about security being ideological has much broader application that relates to IR theory. So if you think about this competition between strategic and ideological arguments as they relate to mass killing, how they're counterparts that can be mapped onto theories of IR. So the ideological ones are, generally speaking, more compatible with constructivist ideas or paradigms. And the strategic ones are sort of more affiliated with realist and in some ways rationalist IR scholarship. And if we think about the realist approach to IR, this is an approach that really, when it looks at the world, it sees states. It's not interested in what's going on in states, right? And so in this type of looking at the world, thinking about national security and equating national interest with national security becomes the conventional, reasonable thing to do, right? So in some ways, this type of thinking is embedded in realist thinking. Now, of course, this is a very theoretically incomplete way of looking at the world that sort of is blind to everything that's going on inside countries, some of the dimensions that I've talked about that have to do with economic redistribution, that have to do with other issues that are sort of ideological but maybe relate to religion or other things, right? So in itself, this is not a problem. So we want our theories to be simple, and being simple in itself is not a problem. But unfortunately, there are serious policy and sort of empirical implications. In particular, this type of way of looking at the world leads to a situation where we really underestimate existing threats, right? So I think a very good example of that, and Jonathan also talked about it a little bit, is what's going on with Russia and Ukraine right now, right? So for years, even after Russia rolled into Crimea, the understanding of Putin was that this is a reasonable person that we can work with. And that's because it's natural for a state like Russia to balance, to worry about its near abroad, so on and so forth. So it's a reflection of a theory that sort of picks on certain ways of looking at or picks on certain types of information and sort of is blind to everything else that might be going on in Russia. So there are, I think, other examples, more extreme examples. You can see that this type of approach also existed when the Third Reich first emerged, and sort of the threat that the Third Reich was posing was also very much underestimated. Again, thinking that, Germany deserves something because it lost so much after the First World War, right? So maybe this guy is reasonable. Obviously, he was not. So this is, I think, where the literature on mass killing and ideology has extensions that are sort of way beyond that. And so I'll just sort of wrap up with one question, and that question is, why is it that sometimes leaders of liberal democracies are sort of very quick to see threats, and other times they have these big blind spots? Why is it that they can't see what's going on in Russia as a sort of increasing extremism and increasing sort of focus on national security at the expense of everything else? And other times, for example, I have in mind the way the American foreign policy was thinking about the Japanese in the interwar period. They're really focused on a country. And I think that's also an interesting research question that's tangential to your theory. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so we're going to come back to these questions, but now Kieran. Thank you very much, Kieran Mitten from King's College London.
Thank you very much. Congratulations. I'm not just saying this because of the free wine, but it definitely helps. It's a really good book. I'm not surprised, but still, I've been having meetings all day with PhD students, master's students, and it naturally just keeps popping up. I keep recommending it to people and saying, well, you've got to read this, you've got to put this on your reading list. And I think it's going to be a go-to text for a lot of people working not just directly on the topic that you're talking about, but a little bit more broadly, right? And I think to some extent you achieve what you set out to do, like essentially putting ideology back on the map, at least from the places where it's been removed, where people aren't talking about it in the right ways. I like in the introduction, you have quite a bold statement about this isn't just about a subset of mass killings where there's a real ideological emphasis in, this is about all mass killings, which is fantastic. And it's a pretty bold start. That's also going to be an essay title, I think, for my students. Discuss, Jonathan, and see what they say. But I come at this, so before I worked on urban violence, as you know, I was working on civil wars, and in particular, I worked on Sierra Leone. I interviewed perpetrators of atrocity in Sierra Leone. So it's not the same, it's not mass killing necessarily, it's certainly not state violence, which you're looking at, but I found so much of this so relevant and so helpful, and echoed many of the things that I encountered, but hadn't articulated very well, and I see in your book you've articulated it very well. So I mean, the book, it's written beautifully. I mean, it's so easy to get into and to follow. It's so logically set out, but the substance is just bang on. So I'm really giving you an easy ride here, just telling you the things I like about your book. Punctuated by...
It's fine, Kieran. It's totally okay.
I mean, the wine, you know? So, I mean, first of all, it will definitely be of interest to scholars of civil war studies, regardless of the nature of the violence. It has so much to say in those contexts, I think. Personally, I have a bias towards the multidisciplinarity of those kind of studies, and this book is full of that. You make so many interesting references across different fields. You draw on social psychology, sociology, political science, and you bring it together in a way that often, you know, it's siloed in unhelpful ways. And you look beyond one particular framework, right? And again, your critique is nuanced. So you don't just throw out a rationalist framework. You point out the importance of that, but you're marrying it with other explanations to give us a much more holistic approach, which I think is fantastic. I also like the way you describe your approach methodologically, that you're basically Detective Jonathan unraveling a mystery and putting the pieces together, rather than hypothesis testing. And I have a bias against that kind of work, but I think the way you explain why you do that and what you do is really helpful. That's valuable in itself. You're not talking about proving anything. It's more about plausibility, but I think you make a really convincing case for your key arguments. I mean, multiple contributions that stand out immediately in the book, but the first for me was just on the nature of ideology and how you define it, and broadening it out to a distinctive political worldview. And I think this is a much broader, as has been mentioned already in your presentation and some of the comments, much broader than often ideology is understood, but I think necessary that we start to see it in this way. And again, from my own perspective, from my own research, it's always been interesting that the RUF has often been critiqued as a non-ideological movement. The rebels were criminal or because they lacked a coherent political agenda, supposedly. But that really ignores a lot of the worldview stuff, and you put that back and you make that central. Here's the first question, which you don't have to answer if you don't have time for it, but that argument was criticized when people made it about the RUF for saying they have an ideology, when some people push back, for essentially elevating their less noble intent, right? If you describe this as ideology, you're somehow either excusing it or at least you're making it seem better than it was. And I wonder if you have any concerns about that when you make your case or any thoughts on that. And the second one, I think, you know, you've already got the answers really in your book, but is there a danger if you define ideology so broadly that all violence relates to ideology? How useful is that anymore? How useful does that become as a term? Again, I mean, building on the comments that you just made as well, I really enjoy the way that you critique the separation of ideology from this notion of national security interests, pragmatic choices. And you show really well in your book how inextricably linked they are, that they inform each other, and that you cannot take one without the other. You cannot look at all of this distinct and separate from ideology. Again, I mean, on the urban violence stuff, I see this all the time, a similar kind of argument around distinguishing between criminal and political. Those distinctions often break down when you realize just how much they're different sides of the same coin to some extent. Again, I guess a similar dichotomy or binary that's a bit problematic is the rationalist frameworks often seeing, you know, the irrational, the emotional, the psychological as somehow an opposite or an alternative. And, you know, like the work of McDoom and others, you do a really good job of showing that we have to take both of those things together and look at their interaction, that you will have rational behavior, but entirely shaped by ideology. And in your introduction, you used the example of the Ottoman Empire and massacres of the Armenian population, and say, even though actually the Armenians weren't working with their Russian enemy, it was still a rational action to take from a certain perspective, from a certain worldview. And I think that demonstrates the argument that you're trying to make very, very well. The stuff that you talk about in terms of threat, again, you articulated it really well in your presentation. I think this is really crucial to so much civil war violence, again, understanding the way in which ideologies can set up the most passive, non-threatening elements of society, civilians, as a threat, and justify extreme actions in that respect, and therefore be quite rational from that view. I think that's really important, and you make that case really well. And I think the point about true believers is also really, really great contribution to this whole field. 2 points that you make that I think are really important, and again, I think it's reiterating what you just said, really. Not everyone believes in the same way to the same extent, but also an individual, they're going to vary in their commitment over time in different circumstances. It's not necessarily the case that ideology works. You either are fully 100% and all the time or you're not. And then the really interesting point, we are all influenced by ideology, even if we don't believe in it. The way that it is embedded in structures around us and shape society, and those social pressures taking us back to that psychological literature and other work. Again, I think you really show how ideologies can't be dismissed, it can't be ignored, because it's always there, even if we ourselves are not, you know, practitioners or believers in a kind of conscious way. Last couple of questions. You talk a little bit at the end about practical implications. I always think is a very horrible question to ask an academic to actually make a practical contribution to the world. But you make some really important points. I think it's particularly where things might have gone wrong. A little bit, for example, focusing on the notion that if we try and prevent mass atrocity, it's about focusing on the people. And actually, you argue time and again, it's actually not necessarily the people that are the problem. And also this idea of big mass communications, and this is how we should do it. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about your thoughts on that, about what the better alternatives are, acknowledging how difficult that is, and perhaps specifically in relation to Russia, Ukraine, if there's anything from your work that you think could have helped or might help in future. And then, yeah, I also would like to hear more about future study. I mean, you mentioned at the end of your book, it's really detailed on where research can go next, which I think is really valuable. You've clearly thought it through very well. You talk about the dogs that don't bark, you know, the cases where you have no mass killing taking place, even though it could have done. Do you think you'll be looking at those? Are you going to get into that terrorism, extremism literature? Or are you just going to take a very long holiday, which you've probably earned? Oh, also, maybe you could tell us about the cover as well.
Yes, pop up. Okay.
The best bit of the book. Thanks very much for such generous comments and discussions. Again, I'm really moved. You know, I obviously agree with all of your compliments about the book. On those particular questions, I mean, so Zeynep's first question and last question, which are kind of related, really hit, I think, and I sort of say this to some extent in the final chapter, at like where I think the most important future debate is, also slightly answering Kieran's question about future research. Namely, okay, I think what I do in this book is make a very convincing case, not definitively prove, but make a convincing case that ideology matters. So then the question becomes, well, what shapes the ideology? right? Why is it that certain regimes at certain times become convinced by these ideologies? And the main argument I make in the book is just, well, there isn't a simple answer to that question, which is why we need to talk about ideology, right? If there was a simple answer, if we could say, oh, economic recessions mean that you get these radical ideologies, well, then economic recessions would be the real explanation or the deeper explanation of mass killing. I don't think that's true. I don't think there's any consistent set or fixed set of things that yield certain radical ideologies to take place at certain times. And that's why I think radical ideologies themselves are such an important part of the explanation. But it's obviously not random chaos. And there is more that we need to be able to say about that. I think I would be inclined, I'll sort of make 2 points. First of all, I think I'd be inclined to agree with you, Zeynep, that it depends on the type of ideology. There isn't a shared general theory of where all what I call hardline ideologies that justify mass killing come from. But there might be more that we could say, and I actually am working a little bit on another project with another person about why specifically genocidal type ideologies come along at particular times, because not all mass killings are genocides. So that would be the direction I would go in. I think we probably have to typologize the types of ideologies and the types of violence they call for, and there might be some things we could say about explanations. For example, it is clear that a big part of the impulse for genocidal ideologies comes out of projects of nation building, right? In fact, to important senses, Zeynep's work is even more closely on this in the past than mine. But why certain states, in the way that they create themselves, need to create ethnically exclusive conceptions of the national community. It's that whole process that leads to certain kinds of radical ethnically based genocidal ideologies, I think. But we'd need to say more about that. The other thing I would say on this question, and particularly targeting this question of, so why do liberal democracies sometimes see threats so strongly and sometimes not? I don't have a simple answer to that question. But what I would say is that I think the big reason to focus on ideology is that it forces you to look at kind of, what's the word here? Sort of slow-moving institutional legacies, right? We didn't react properly to Hitler or to Putin. We didn't see the threat early enough because our existing conventional wisdom was that, well, Germany has genuine grievances and that's totally understandable, or Putin is an opportunistic actor, he's not going to do something mad and irrational, right? We're guided by the existing ideas, and that's kind of what an approach that focuses on ideology tries to pay attention to, is in what senses do elites and policymakers and intellectuals and ordinary people's existing worldview problematically shape their subsequent thinking, often in problematic ways. Where we overinflate notions of threat, I think it tends to be because we've got the priors, we've got the existing ideas that are very sensitive to being inflamed by those kind of threats. So, you know, Islamic terrorism, well, that picked up on a lot of existing concerns about radical Islam and lots of tropes and stereotypes about that. It also, in certain countries, not so much the US, where 9/11 was a more kind of radical fulcrum-changing event, but in other countries, you know, they had legacies of their own domestic terrorism to a much greater extent than they did, say, of Russian aggression, right? So I think it's a lot about prior ideas and how that, you know, you have this kind of theory of slow-moving change in ideologies, and sometimes rapid change. Again, a future project that I do plan to do is thinking more about why do we get rapid ideological change at particular moments in time. Finally, on the practical implications question, yeah, I'm a big opponent of self-promoting academics. And I dislike people over-claiming what they should. I don't know how to solve the problem of atrocities in practice, and anyone who tells you that they do is lying to you. But I think that, but I'll say two things. One, the book certainly aims to help people forecast atrocities better, right? You know, I'm not saying I had all the answers because I wasn't enough of a Russian specialist, but people who I know who are Russian specialists, I think if you took their wisdom combined with some of the arguments in this book, we would have had a much better anticipation of Russia engaging in something like the kind of behavior it's engaging in Ukraine than we did from sort of standard rationalist models. On more concrete practical implications, I mean, one, it's a slightly small one, but like ordinary efforts to kind of educate people about peace in other countries are well worth doing, but I don't think they target the primary risk, which comes from militaries and security agencies and elites. And so things like military training programs, where we try and inculcate respect for international humanitarian law in military institutions in other countries, would for me be a more effective method. We do that a bit, we should probably do it more. Things that target the institutional structures of the state and its main weapons of violence, I think are kind of more the kind of stuff that I think is being underrated and undervalued at the moment. There's much else I'd like to say, but I also want to let us have a proper discussion with the audience, so I'll stop there.
So I'm going to ask Zeynep and Kieran whether you have any final thoughts.
Just a big congratulations from me. That's it.
Kieran?
Yeah, I'm going to go with a big congratulations.
A big congratulations. A big congratulations from, I think, all of the audience and from me. And
Final couple of words from me, because I haven't talked enough. Finally, want to repeat thanks to DPE, who have funded this event, and also the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society, who have supported the generous filming from our generous cameraman here to film tonight's event. Comment 2. I am going to now sell some of the books if you want to come up and get one for £30, massive discount on the completely unfeasible price of the actual book itself. I'll sign it for you if you want. If you don't have £30 in cash, you can PayPal me through Google Mail. So I'll just stick around at the front to do that for anyone who wants a copy. Finally, bit of a weird way to end the book launch of Ideology and Mass Killing, but it just happens that 5 days ago my second book came out, which is edited rather than single-authored, but is the Routledge Handbook of Ideology and International Relations. Going back to Zeynep's comment about how this might be useful for IR more generally. I've just got one copy here if anyone wants to come and have a look at that book as well up at the front. Other than that, it's been such a total pleasure to speak to you, and I'm really touched that you're all here. Thanks very much for helping me celebrate.